Alright, this is Block 8, Effects of Television on the Culture, brought to you from the DI Annex here the night before that you guys have to watch this essay. One of the biggest technological changes kind of in American cultural history was clearly the television, which is invented in the late 1920s and is kind of an oddity, something that like crazy, weird, rich people have through the 1940s. But by 1950, there's several thousand television sets in the United States, and by 1960, almost everyone has one. Upwards of 90% of the population. It came into American culture as quickly as cell phones did. It's kind of a good parallel between television and cell phones, that cell phones went from something that only kind of crazy, rich, strange people had to absolutely ubiquitous. Everybody had them within the span of about a decade. And television was kind of the same way. It has a fundamental transformative powers on American culture. We're going to try to go through some social, some economic, some political, and some cultural changes that all took place due to the prevalence of television. So TV is one of those things where, its defenders were like, this is going to be the greatest thing in history, and it was really kind of cool, television. They said people are going to learn on their TVs. All people are going to watch our educational programs, and okay. There were some educational programs, but obviously, there was lots of non-educational programs on television. People started to, this was kind of the time where people stopped talking to each other. That it was much easier to go inside and watch television than to, sit outside with your neighbors, or to go downtown and talk to some people on the street and kind of in your neighborhood. That it's easy to lay on the couch and watch a television program. So there's less interaction with others, and what that does is it kind of decreases social capital. You trust your neighbors less. You're less likely to kind of pitch in. You're less likely to help out. There's more likely to be crime. If there's people out on the stoops all the time, then crimes of opportunity are less likely to happen. So, with this decreasing social capital, as people were interacting with each other less and less, was definitely a result of TV. Obesity starts to be a thing more and more kids are sitting in front of the television as opposed to running around outside in their neighborhoods. But of course, people loved it because it's entertaining and it's interesting and it's funny. It supports new industries. It supports advertising. That people create new television stars. That TV was this huge thing, with these significant economic roles. Everybody in the business of broadcasting TV and regulating TV. I'm lecturing it. Whoever it is, tell them I'll call them back. Who is it?
No one from the...
Okay, tell her I'll call her back. I'm sorry. That's what you get for doing this in school. New industries, anybody involved, television repairman became a job that didn't exist before. So obviously there's economic growth that kind of goes along with, this new invention. Someone has to make the antennas and, shoot the scenes and write them and all those sorts of things. It had some interesting political effects on television. The first was in 1952. Richard Nixon was running for vice president with Dwight D. Eisenhower, and there was some questions over whether some donors had given Nixon gifts, and whether those gifts, obviously were, the idea being, here's a president, now do what we want you to do. And Nixon gets on. It's really the first televised political speech in American history in 1952. And Nixon comes on and he seems, really, sincere, and which he was. And he says, what this present was? He said it was a little Cocker Spaniel dog. And Tricia, our 6-year-old, named him Checkers. The gift that he had received was a puppy that he gave to his little 6-year-old daughter. And he kind of said, all these people are saying that I'm a crook, that I'm taking these gifts, and that there's, these quid pro quos. And what was the gift? It was a dog, and we named the dog Checkers. Who can be against Checkers, the dog? And it was definitely, it kind of made the attacks on Nixon less believable. Now that people could kind of see Nixon and see that he was so sincere about what he believed. Nixon kind of used the power of TV in 1952, and the power of TV kind of came back to bite him a little bit in 1960 when he was running for president against John Kennedy. This was the first televised debate in American history, and Nixon was kind of an old school guy. Nixon said, this is TV. I'm Nixon. I'm a man. I'm not going to put on makeup. I don't put on makeup for television cameras. I'm just going to go out there and do my thing and debate President Kennedy. And Kennedy was kind of a creature of the media in a lot of ways. And Kennedy put on the makeup and made sure he shaved right before he went out there in the evening. Nixon didn't. So they get in front of the cameras, and Nixon kind of has this 5 o'clock shadow on his face, and he's not made up, so he kind of looks like pale and sweaty. And of course, Kennedy looks $1,000,000. And the power of the visual part, kind of in politics, is made clear by those people who listened to the debate on radio. Kind of agreed that Nixon won, while those people who watched the debate on television said that Kennedy had won. So becoming an attractive person kind of became an important part of being a candidate, and that's something that really kind of hasn't stopped. We don't want our candidates to be ugly. They should be relatively fit, relatively attractive people. Someone like William Howard Taft, who was 350 pounds, would have a tough time getting elected today, because she just doesn't look good on camera. Chris Christie's a good example. Chris Christie, when he decided he might want to run for president, went and got, the weight loss surgery, and Governor Christie's lost a lot of weight. Why? A, for his health, of course, but B, because we have an expectation that our candidates look good on television. And that kind of is another effect of this TV culture. Another key thing that happened in television was in the late 1960s when the Vietnam War was on TV. That every night, images from the war, images from the fighting were beamed right into America's living rooms. And as the war started as the war kind of went from a war that everybody said we were winning to a war where even though people said we were winning, it didn't look like we were winning. That, the same footage was kind of on TV every night. The Viet Cong were still there, and American troops were still there, and as many bombs as we dropped in Viet Cong that we killed, there was more Viet Cong there. And at one point, in 1968, one of America's trusty news anchors kind of looked at the American people and said, there is no light at the end of this tunnel. And newscasters were very trustworthy folks back then. It was the guy that kind of beamed into your house, every night and told you what the news was. And they were kind of these elderly gentlemen with this gravitas, and what they said was the truth. It was like listening to your priest or the school principal or someone. It was an authority figure. And when the authority figure gets on television and looks you straight in the eye and says, there is no light at the end of this tunnel, kind of your fears about Vietnam start to be realized that, maybe this war is not being won like the government says it's being won. So a lot of different political consequences to television. But the biggest consequence is cultural. And it comes from the idea that for the kind of, this already started with radio, but it increases even more with television, is by the 1960s and 70s and 80s, Americans are all watching the same shows. This is before cable. So you basically had maybe 5 or 6 channels that you got up to change. Oh my God. You had to get off the couch to change the channel. And those 5 or 6 channels, everyone's watching the same stuff. Everyone's watching I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver and the Nightly News and MASH and all those great shows of the 50s, The Honeymooners. There's so many of them. Gilligan's Island. The list goes on and on. Some people, if you grew up in that time, you love that stuff. But there were so few shows on that everyone was kind of entertained by the same thing, and it kind of created this mass culture. Everybody knew, when you went to when you went to work the next day, most people had watched I Love Lucy. And, if you went to school next day, everybody in your 5th grade class had seen Leave It to Beaver, and you could joke about, little Beaver Cleaver's, exploits the night before, Lassie, or whatever the case may be. Not only did people see the same shows, people saw the same advertising. That you start to get this mass consumer culture that everybody watches I Love Lucy and sees the same ad for Ford. And everyone's like, well, I really love I Love Lucy and I need a Ford. That's kind of everyone gets the news from the same place. You know, the average person sits down, watches the nightly news, and that's the news. That there's not all these different alternate places where people can get their entertainment and their news like there is now. And it really did go a long way in creating this mass, middle-class, consumerist, white, generally, culture that looked like a part of America. And because it was so ubiquitous, you could easily think that that was all of America. Obviously it's not, but it gives off that sense that this is what America looks like. It looks like the Cleaver family. You know, dad goes to work, mom is at home, there's 3 kids at home, and they all get into little troubles that is solved in the end of 21 minutes. That was the reality for a lot of people. For millions of people, that's the reality. But it did portray this look of what America was like to the world and to Americans also, that is going to be challenged in ways and is going to kind of create what America is in a lot of ways also.